This afternoon's speaker is the author of Stealing Lincoln's Body, published by the Harvard University Press and actually released today. He has written more than a dozen books on history, religion, and popular culture. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the American Spectator, Emmy Magazine, and Inside the Vatican. He has also been a guest on CNN, the BBC, the Discovery Channel, and the International Catholic Cable Network, EWTN. He writes out of his home in Bethel, Connecticut. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Craughwell.
Thank you, John. It's especially pleasant for me to be here today because the two gentlemen who are up at the dais with us, who were such an enormous help to me when I was researching this book. First of all, Dr. Wayne Temple, a gentleman who could find anything I was looking for. And my friend John Austin, who, when I approached him about using his archive, said, "Oh, we don't have anything that you'd need." And a day and a half, and God knows how many file boxes later, so I'm very pleased to be here today with all of you. If the Lincoln Monument Association had had their way back in 1865, we would not have gone out to the cemetery this morning for the ceremony. We would have gone to the site of the state capitol, because the gentlemen of the Monument Association wanted to bury Abraham Lincoln in a place that was prominent, that was in the middle of town, that was going to draw a lot of attention, bring in a lot of tourists, new business, possibly new residents. In this regard, they ran up against Mary Lincoln. When Lincoln died, there were really three contenders for his burial site. One was Washington, D.C. Underneath the Capitol Rotunda, there was a vault, a crypt, that had been prepared for George Washington. It was never used because George and Martha wanted to be buried together at Mount Vernon. A second runner-up was Chicago, because the Lincolns had discussed retiring to Chicago at the end of the second term, but they had no real ties to the city, so that was ruled out pretty quickly. The Capitol crypt was out of the question because there was only room for Lincoln, and Mary was not going to let him go any place that she was not going to go. So the logical solution, obviously, was Springfield, their home. By coincidence, the governor of Illinois, Richard Oglesby, was in Washington at the time of the assassination, and when he found out that Springfield was the destination, he was simply delighted and wired home, and within a matter of hours, they had the most distinguished men in town, including the Lincoln's banker, Jacob Bunn, and Mary's cousin, John Todd Stewart, coming together, creating an organization with the idea of raising money and selecting a site for the tomb. Selecting the site for the tomb was what got them into trouble. Mary Lincoln wanted Oak Ridge. And she wanted it for a couple of reasons. First of all, the story of Lincoln wanting to be buried in a quiet place. And Oak Ridge was decidedly quiet, 2 to 3 miles outside of town. Secondly, it was what was part of what was called at the time the rural cemetery movement. This had started up in the 1830s. In Boston, Mount Auburn was the very first rural cemetery. The purpose of a rural cemetery was to get away from the crowded, unsightly burial grounds and churchyards that were inside cities and create a place that was part botanical garden, part outdoor art museum, a beautiful, restful place for the dead, but also a place that families would be pleased to go and visit on weekends. Bringing picnic lunches was perfectly acceptable at the time, and these places were truly lovely. Every town, after the success of Mount Auburn in the 1830s, every city and town with any pretensions to gentility wanted their own rural cemetery. About 1850, Springfield got Oak Ridge, and the Lincolns were actually among the dignitaries who attended the dedication. Now, the site that the Lincoln Monument Association wanted was called the Mather Block. It was a piece of property where the state capitol is now. It was owned by a widow named Hannah Mather. It was the only house, her house was the only one on the block. Groves of trees, a garden. It was a lovely, beautiful place. It was the highest point in town. You could see it from the trains that were passing in and out of Springfield. It would be very easy for tourists to get to the Lincoln tomb there. If they went out to Oak Ridge, they were going to have to take them out by trolleys or by carriage. It just seemed a logistical nightmare. And so they decided to ignore what Mary wanted, and they actually sent a crew of excavators and stonemasons out to the Mather Block to start building a little temporary crypt. Now, when Mary Lincoln back in Washington heard that her friends and neighbors and relatives were ignoring her wishes, she had Secretary of War Stanton send a telegram saying expressly, not to the Mather Block, but out to Oak Ridge. And at this point, Robert Lincoln backed up his mother and sent his own telegram saying that we demand that the family's wishes be respected. So they slammed on the brakes. By this point, really, the little temporary tomb at the Mather Block was done, right down to the ornamental urns flanking the door. And the Lincoln train is getting closer and closer. But they stopped, and they sent another work crew out to Oak Ridge to tidy up the receiving vault, which is down in the ravine at the bottom of the hill below the Lincoln Monument, to prepare that for Lincoln. And that's where he and Willie were placed on the day of the funeral. And that's where the doors were locked. The key was given to Robert Lincoln. He passed it along to his cousin, John Todd Stewart, and they started the ball rolling for building a Lincoln monument. Or so the Lincoln family thought, because after the funeral, the National Monument Association, apparently people who could not take a hint, leaked to the Springfield newspapers that they were really going to bury him in the Mather Block after all. Well, Mary read the Springfield newspapers. So now she's delivered an ultimatum. She did not simply want a family tomb anymore. She wanted something dynastic. She wanted a tomb that was going to be large enough for the president, for her, for their sons' wives, the wives of their surviving sons, and for any grandchildren that she might have. She wanted the whole thing. They actually, at one point, the governor and some of the other members of the Monument Committee went up to Chicago. She was living there. They were going to try and make a personal appeal to her to let them use the Mather Block. Not only would she refuse to see them, but she sent Robert to the train station telling them it's pointless, go home. And so finally they did cave in, and they built the tomb out at Oak Ridge. Now we flash forward about 10 years. And there's a man in Chicago named Big Jim Keneally. And Big Jim Keneally led a counterfeiting ring. He was an Irish immigrant. He had been in and out of jail for passing counterfeit money. In spite of his name, Big Jim was actually small potatoes in terms of the crime world in Illinois. We know he had one other interest. He was a silent partner in a saloon on the near west side of Chicago, a place called The Hub. His other partner was a man named Terence Mullen, also an Irish immigrant. Terence Mullen was 28 years old. He had no criminal record, but his saloon was a hangout for counterfeiters. And one of his cronies was a man named Jack Hughes. Jack Hughes passed counterfeit money, and he had also, well, let's call him the underachiever of counterfeiters, because back in Philadelphia, where other counterfeiters would produce $5, $10, $20 bills, Jack Hughes produced counterfeit nickels. Poor quality counterfeit nickels, because he was constantly being arrested in Philadelphia, and finally the town got too hot for him and he moved out to Chicago. Now, although Big Jim Keneally was not a big deal, he did have one very important asset. He had one of the finest engravers, counterfeit engravers in the country working for him, a man named Benjamin Boyd. Boyd was from Cincinnati. He was the son of an engraver, a legitimate engraver. His father had apprenticed him when he was a kid to a legitimate engraver. But sometime in his late teens, he started running into counterfeit engravers. And by the time he was 21, he had engraved his first counterfeit plate, and that was the end of his legitimate career. He never engraved another christening cup or wedding ring.